And for all the students here, thanks for joining us on Valentine's Day. Did you buy anything out front? They have a lot of Valentine's gear. No? If anyone needs anything, I don't know if you walk out the door, there's plenty of stuff.
Peter, I thought you said Valentine's beer.
No beer, but there are a ton of people selling Valentine's Day things outside of CBC. So if you need anything, Karen, you don't have to go far. So Esther and Karen, whenever you guys feel like you want to start, we're ready in here. We have about 7 of us, but we're ready whenever you guys are.
Okay, then I will get started, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Andrew McCarthy. And let me start by apologizing that I was unable to be there in person today, Andrew. I really would have liked to have. I owe you something at the NAAs, a beer or something. But let me introduce our colleague, Dr. Andrew McCarthy. He comes from us from the College of Southern Nevada, where he is a professor in the department. He has a very impressive vita. It's fun to read our colleagues' vitas. He received his PhD in 2003 from the University of Edinburgh. He has more than something wrong. Okay, has more than 80 academic publications, including 5 books or volumes, 2 of which are will be forthcoming this year on his work in Cyprus. He has raised more than $1 million for archaeological and heritage research projects. And he works primarily in the Middle East and in Cyprus, but he has also served as the director of archaeological excavations at the Las Vegas Springs Preserves. So been working, I believe, a bit since he's come here. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our terrific colleague, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks for those of you in the audience here. And thanks for those joining remotely as well. Apologize, taking my mask down just so people that are looking at me online can probably hear me and understand me a little bit better with seeing my mouth move. So I'd like to talk to you today about a site that I've been working on for a number of years, almost 20 years now, with the university, with Yale University, excavations at the site of Tell Leilan in Syria. And this is an opportunity for me to not just talk about the site and its the ancient past, but also we often use archaeology as an example of how we can learn from past behaviors to try and improve future results in our own lives. But we also have to keep in mind that understanding the past should remain sort of a pure discipline, that we shouldn't bring our own biases, our own perspectives, our own way of looking at the past into the past. We should look at it on its own merits and construct an accurate view of what happened in the past. But once we've done that, there's nothing stopping us from saying, all right, what did they do, and maybe how can we do better than them? And let's face it, humans have not really changed very much. We do different things. But we're still humans. And so this is a really valid example of how I'm going to show you that a once thriving and successful community, which we tend to think of as the first empire in the world ever. So things that you're going to be familiar with, social structures, economic systems, a lot of things that will be familiar to you, collapsed all of a sudden. And this is where the title, The Curse of Akkad, comes from. This was an ancient poem written about trying to explain how a once thriving great community, society that dominated over most of the Middle East just collapsed suddenly, and why that was. The curse was considered to be something that was done by human hubris, and the gods punished Akkad for its own destruction. But archaeology tells a more nuanced story. It tells a story about a multiplicity of factors, multivariate factors. And climate change is one of those things, which I probably don't need to tell you that that's something of concern today. So this is a lesson that we can learn from the past that may be able to help us in the present day and possibly in the future. So when I say that the Akkadian Empire was an empire, what does that even mean? So definitions they vary, but I think we could agree that it's an aggregate of nations or people ruled over by an emperor or other powerful sovereign or government, usually a territory of greater extent than a kingdom. So in other words, an empire tends to be not just one community, but a domination over multiple communities. So a single kingdom is a kingdom, but an empire is one that dominates over multiple identities, economic systems, and power structures. And this can be made solely of contiguous territories or of territories far remote from the homeland. And we tend to think of this as a colonial empire. So the British Empire is one that comes to mind with colonial empire. What we're going to be talking about is more closely related to contiguous territory, so expansion out of a central area and taking over neighboring territories. But as we're going to see, it's a little bit nuanced even there. And these can exist with different economic strategies. It doesn't have to be just one size fits all. This is how an empire functions. So I won't dwell on this too much. But, imperialism and colonialism are related but somewhat separate. And so the imperialism that we're speaking about here, Edward Said mentioned, is the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory. And colonialism refers to implanting of settlements on a distant territory. I think what we're probably going to be talking about is more closely related to imperialism, and hence the word empire is relevant here.
Dr. McCarthy, you hear someone unmuted online. Esther, could you check who that is and maybe mute whomever that might be? Sounds like someone's eating lunch.
Or a dog.
Or a dog, yeah. Share if you're going to eat lunch. Thanks, Esther.
Okay. So the first empire is often considered to be a true empire, although there is some discussion about this. But you could also think that maybe it's an expansion of socioeconomic identity as well into these areas that are not to the core of Akkad, which I will come to in a moment here. And it could also be thought of as economic expansion. So we're going to see that the Akkadian Empire gets its name from the capital city of Akkad, which is undiscovered and unexcavated. This may be because it was obliterated. This may be because it's underneath a modern inhabitation. But in any case, we have not identified with any confidence where the capital city of this empire was. But we do have places under its domination, including those that are central, nearby, where we think the capital city would have been, probably within its own kingdom. But we also have evidence from the places that were conquered, places that were inhabited before the Akkadians came into contact with them, and then were taken over in various ways. And the case studies that I'm going to be talking about are from Syria, all three of them. Urkesh, modern Tel Mozan, Telbrac, ancient Nagar, and Tell Leilan, the site that I worked at, which was ancient Shena. These are all in the Middle East, which is indicated on the map there. Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran. These are all modern countries which the Akkadian Empire would have existed in the past. Those countries didn't exist then. So the Akkadian Empire got its start in the city of Akkad by a non-royal person who rose to power. There's a lot of legends written about Sargon the Great of Akkad, who reigned for a very long time. Now, in his lifetime, there was a point where there was no Akkadian Empire, and then he was the foundation of it, and so the Akkadian Empire started to expand within his lifetime. And I'm going to come back to what that means in a little bit. But he had sons who took over from him and created a dynastic line. Rimush first, and then Tushu. Naram Sin, the very famous king, which we'll spend a fair amount of time on. And then later Shar-Kalashari and the very late Akkadian kings Dudu and Shudurul before the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Tushu, we know about some of these people, the descendants of Sargon the Great, by things like the Tushu stele here that you see inscribed with his exploits and things. Also the statuary that we find with inscriptions as well. So we have both artifactual evidence and we also have literary evidence about these people and even some of their imagery that's left behind. Naram Sin, as I said, we're going to focus on, reigned as long as his grandfather did, and arguably impacted the Akkadian Empire and expanded it as much as the Sargon the Great did. But as we will see, he did something that didn't sit well with everybody, although it may have been necessary to holding together an empire. And the Curse of Akkad is really written about him and his hubris. So then you can see that Shar-Kalashari continued. This didn't end with Naram Sin, the Akkadian Empire. It actually expanded, and Shar-Kalashari also expanded and conquered even more territories. And it only really started to retract and come to an end in the final years under Dudu or Shudurul, or after Dudu, probably in Shudurul's reign. Naram Sin, some of the earliest evidence we have for his reign are on stone-carved stele that you see on the right-hand side, or in this rock-carved frieze that you see here, where he is shown larger than life, stepping on his vanquished enemies with a battle axe, and he is climbing a mountain there. You often see him in battle posture because this was a territorial, expansive empire. This was part of, as we'll see, their success was to absorb more and more territory and bring it into the central core. So this was an empire that was being formed by war. And so images of war were very important to maintain its whole reason for being. And you can see in this this map here that the Akkad is somewhere right there in the central part of the Mesopotamia, the north of Ki-Engir, the southern Mesopotamian territory. They spoke Akkadian, although this was a mixed language area where Sumerian would also have been spoken. And after the Akkadian Empire, Akkadian became the lingua franca for thousands of years. Akkadian became the dominant language until the AD-BC divide. Literary texts, official communications between and even legal texts were all written in Akkadian. So this had a huge impact culturally as well as economically and socially. And you can see that from that central core, there were territorial expansions, but there were also forays into different regions like Elam in modern Iran, Ebla in Syria, and into Turkey as well, up the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. In the north, I mentioned before that we're going to look at Tell Leilan, Telbrac, and Tell Leilan. These are what are referred to as the Hebor Triangle. It is the area in the Hebor Basin, which feeds into the Euphrates River, fed from the mountains in Turkey. And we tend to think of the Middle East, or at least it's often portrayed, the Middle East is portrayed as a big desert. It's more likely, or it's more accurate to compare it to a place like Nebraska. It's sitting on a huge aquifer, so there's underground water to be had if you can tap that. There's also big rivers that flow through it, the Tigris, Euphrates, and its tributaries. And also, from this map, you can see that there is rain-fed agriculture. When you go down into where Akkad is, in southern Mesopotamia, there is not enough rain to grow crops. You have to irrigate. So all of this water coming down the rivers can be tapped to spread out into fields and grow the crops that can sustain cities. But in the north of Mesopotamia, that's not as easy to do. It's hillier. There's more topography that requires big canals if you want to make those, or you just wait for the rain to fall, and it does fall. So it's actually a big breadbasket, the north of Mesopotamia, unlike what often is popularly described. So this map shows that the Akkadian heartland has to be irrigation agriculture, whereas the peripheral areas, the places it is conquering, are rain-fed agriculture, which are big producers, but require that rain to fall. And there were different communities that lived there even before the Akkadians came in. So the land of Sumer, Ki-Engi and Ki-Uri, which was in the north of that area, southern Mesopotamia, were mainly Akkadian speakers, and in the south were Sumerian speakers, although this was mixed. You had a Semitic language in the west, the Eblatic, and the Amuru tribes, and you had a different language family and different cultural group to the north, the Hurrian kingdoms in the area of Subartu, Subaru, and even a different one to the east, the Elamite kingdoms, which is a different language and different culture as well. So all clustered in this area is not just the Akkadians, it's not just one cultural group, it is multiple groups. And the Akkadian Empire, when it expanded outside of its heartland, it had to incorporate these other identities, these other kingdoms, these other social and political structures. So how do you do that? Do you just dominate them? Is that okay? Are people going to accept that? Or do you have to vary your approaches? Can you use diplomacy? Can you agree to come in and trade, or come up with some sort of a system to have non-coercive methods of taking over? So in the heartland, we see that the Akkadian Empire, the Akkadian Kingdom, was based on a redistributive economy. That means that essentially people didn't own what they produced. They participated in this economy by sending everything to a central storerooms that were administered by centralized authorities, either the palace or the temple. And if you were a farmer, you produced grain that was not your grain to eat. It went to a central storeroom, and then you got back wages. You got back a portion of what you grew, and you could eat that. But all of this central storage meant that this grain production was the property of whoever that centralized authority was. And they could decide how much individuals get. And so this would go to specialized labor. So warriors and security got some of this grain that was stored in the central storerooms. Specialized craftspeople got centralized storerooms. The people that maintained the canals and the irrigation, the ditch diggers, they got their wages as well. Everybody got something from this centralized storeroom, and the people in control of it, the priests and the kings, were in charge of it all. So when you expanded this empire, this was what their economic system was set up to do, was to have a centralized economy, redistributive economy. So let's look at a case study here, Tel Mozan or Kesh, excavated by the Bucciolatis from UCLA. This was the capital of the Hurrian kingdom, or at least a capital of the Hurrian kingdom. And when Akkad moved into when the Akkadian Empire started moving into this area, probably during Naram Sin's reign, they decided that they were going to use diplomacy, not just conquest. In fact, like I said, some of these things may be familiar to you. Naram Sin married his daughter off to the ruler at Urkesh to create a political and familial alliance. So he wasn't going to fight them. This was his brother-in-law now. But that also meant that you could trade, and you couldn't really abuse that relationship as much. This was a way to create a diplomatic marriage. This is something we hear about in Europe post Middle Ages, even to this day. So we have the Mountbattens in the UK, you know, the Stuart Mountbattens. So Taram Akkad married into the Hurrian royal family, and this is one way that you can establish that imperial expansion into a territory that's not your own. At Telbrac, Nagar, excavated by the Oates most recently, John and Joan Oates, who from University of Cambridge. This is a huge site that was originally excavated by Agatha Christie and Sir Max Mallowan, famously. And they had a different approach at Telbrac. Telbrac was a flourishing, thriving, pre-Akkadian city that had its own economy. They were very well known for raising a type of ass, an onager, and they were very successful and powerful in this region. And when the Akkadians came in, they set up an outpost. So they didn't change very much there. They just set up an administrative center on the Acropolis, and they said, keep doing what you're doing, but we're taking our cut now. So this was another tack. This almost sounds a little bit like colonialism, right? So a different way of doing an imperial expansion. And then at Shena, also a thriving pre-Akkadian city before the Akkadians came in. This was taken over late in the Akkadian Empire, probably during Dudu's reign, and they traded with Akkad beforehand. So they were just a partner that was trading both locally but also with the south, and they retained some autonomy probably during Naram Sin's reign, while Akkadian expansion was taking place in the region. So the part of the way that you control an empire that's expanding into different communities and different identities is you have different facets to the economy. There's the palace, there's large-scale private trading done through what we call oikos economy, which is like large-scale households. And then you have just your everyday, how do you go into the grocery store and buying your stuff and cooking your food that evening. That's household economy. But you also have things like the temple economy, which gives justification for taxation. Things like, we're taking this money because the gods require us to do certain things. That this is all divinely ordained. This system that you're in is not one that you can opt out of. This is all divine plan. So the temple economy is sort of a binder. It keeps all of these things together. So what Naram Sin did in his reign is he started to depict himself as a god. And that fused the temple and the palace together in one role. And how do we know that he was depicting himself as a god? Well, he showed himself here in the posture of a god. Now, this looks very similar to the one that you saw earlier, but I'll just point out here that he has horns on his head. Now, those horns are exclusively for deities. Those are god horns. And so he has now moved from just being the ruler of an empire into the god ruler of an empire. And I'll just point out here, we'll come back to this little design motif with this elbow of this person who is attacking a foe. That is only really in the late Akkadian period. So this is one of the earliest examples of that posture of the elbow up in that weird, really awkward position. We're going to see that again. So here's a cylinder seal impression of a bunch of gods doing stuff. The mountains are below. They're much, much larger than anything else. There's fish and water coming out the shoulders of one god. Another has two faces, but you see they all have horns. This is representation of gods. This is unambiguous to anybody who was living at the time. If you have horns like this, you are a god. So this was when Naram Sin presented himself with those horns, there was no question about it. Anyone who saw that image would have seen that that was Naram Sin, the god. And there that is again. So these images of power were combined to bring together the palace, private industry and trade, the military, and the temple all together under divine accord. And this was a way that Naram Sin could justify his taking over of places that were outside of his own homeland. So it's possible that an empire like this needs a god to hold this together in a pluralistic, divisive, and tenuous empire. And Naram Sin used symbolism to consolidate his power. He fused the temple, palace, trade, and agricultural production into a homogeneous bureaucratic system. But the problem is that this is an intrinsically weak system. It's fragile. We're going to see that were growing crops, and that was what their economy was all about, monocrop culture. It was barley and wheat, mainly wheat, huge quantities of wheat. That was where their wealth was coming from, and it all had to come into this central system and then back out to get redistributed over huge territories. But also that over-specialization in a particular type of economic system was intrinsically linked to an individual, the emperor. And so what happens when that emperor dies? What if you don't have a charismatic leader that can carry you through tough times? Or what if the times become too tough? Well, they did become too tough. And the interpretation from in the past, this was a story that was written after the fall of Akkad and was rewritten over and over and retold over and over again This was a very popular story, the Curse of Akkad, where Naram Sin destroys the god Enlil's temple in Nippur in southern Mesopotamia. And Enlil, who did not like this, sent disaster, famine on the land. And the other gods were like, look, Enlil's pretty angry here. Let's just get rid of Akkad, and then the rest of humanity will be saved, because Enlil can be appeased. And with that, all of the gods came down on Akkad, and it fell forever, never to rise again. This is the Curse of Akkad. Well, do we believe that Enlil's temple getting defiled is really the cause of this? In more recent years, obviously, archaeology tries to build up scientific evidence for the ancient cultures. And Harvey Weiss, that you see right here, has been the director of Tell Leilan excavations since 1978. He was one of the first Westerners to go into Syria and excavate since the 1940s, really. And he came to a site that he thought it was one of the largest in the area, and he started excavating. He became famous. What you see here, Science magazine publication, is actually a different time period when we know it was Shubat Enlil, the hollow capital of Shamshi Adad in the Old Babylonian period from the 2nd millennium BC, so about 1800 BC. Shamshi Adad, who was the king in Babylon, had a remote outpost kingdom which didn't really have anybody living there. They just had a palace, and Harvey Weiss excavated this beautiful palace, and this was Shamshi Adad's palace from the Old Babylonian period. Now, this is unrelated to what we're going to talk about here, because prior to this establishment of this hollow capital, there was a long hiatus, which we're going to look at, and a thriving city before that Shamshi Adad may not have even known about. He just came to this site and said, nobody's living here, let's build our palace here. Good spot for it. So Tell Leilan is situated in Syria, sort of wedged in there in the area between Turkey and Iraq in the far east of Syria. And this is a map, a contour map of the roughly 70-hectare site. It's big, and it has different aspects to it. You have the lower town, which is walled, and you have the Acropolis, and it's situated right beside a stream that provided it with water. And just a brief explanation of what's happening in northern Mesopotamia. We tend to think of southern Mesopotamia as where civilization comes from. I don't like that word, but northern Mesopotamia formed its states just as early as in the south, but it was a different format. And when both southern Mesopotamia and northern Mesopotamia were developing cities, or at least identities that we could call state-level identities, they started to come in contact with one another. This is in the 4th millennium, the Uruk period, and the Jumna Nasser periods. And then there was sort of an equilibrium in the north, that they just kept carrying on doing what they were doing until secondary state formation, inspired by some of the developments that were taking place in the south, started to impact the north, and the cities in the north started to look a lot more like the ones in the south. This is what we call secondary state formation, and rapid urbanization took place in this area around 2600 BC. And what we get from some of the artistic designs on glyptic objects, which we'll see, they exhibit a combination of indigenous designs and an increasing influx of designs from the south. So their culture is also getting influenced. And in the second half of the 3rd millennium, the Akkadian Empire specifically starts to spread and dominate over it to some extent. So the time periods that we're looking here, I'm going to refer to some of these periods. We're going from 3 is the earliest, 2, A, B, C is the post-Akkadian period and the hiatus, and then the Old Babylonian is the period 1 at Tell Leilan there. So what we're looking at mainly is going to be this 3D, 2A, 2B periods, and then into the 2C. We tend to think of archaeological periods as just moving through time as blocks, checking your watch and saying, okay, we're no longer Ninevite 5, everybody set we're now early Bronze 2, and it doesn't really work that way, right? It's more nuanced, it's subtler, it's more gradual. And so we tend to think of things like territorial expansion as just being like this wave of conquest that goes through a region, but it's actually probably more something like a piecemeal addition of different types. And we saw that at Urkesh, we saw that at Leilan, and we saw that at Telbrac. And also the collapse of societies also is not just a complete wave of destruction. It can also be a piecemeal scaling back, with some sites maybe not dropping out altogether, which we'll see Tel Mozan actually probably doesn't completely collapse. So Tell Leilan, here's an aerial photograph from the 1930s. You can see, and this is the Acropolis. This is the lower town. This is the Acropolis northwest excavations, which you'll see some of. And this is the city gate excavations, which we'll look at right now. So in 2001, I came to the site and it looked like this. A bulldozer thought they were doing good work to expand the road to the site, but they actually cut through the city gate, what was long thought to be the city walls, and we cleaned up their damage and excavated a trench alongside the bulldozed portion and got some very highly detailed information about it. And we do suspect this was a city gate because of what we found there. So it's not just a wall, but there were actually structures there and probably people coming in and out of the city, channeling objects. And we have dates that the period 3D fortification wall, we have very good dates for the foundation of this and the expansion of the lower town to be the full 70-hectare site. And then we have a series of interior spaces and features until the abandonment in the hiatus period that you see there. And that green that you see at the top is this big pile of wind-blown dust that covered not just here, but the entire site. And this is what is called the hiatus period. And look how big that is. That's dust that was blown in and covered the entire site. The Curse of Akkad. So at this location, you can see that seal impressions, administrative residue of any type are the dominant artifact type there. So that's really what they were doing, was they were checking people's goods as it was coming into the city or leaving the city, probably taking taxes. And this is pre-Akkadian. This is what they're doing before the Akkadians rolled in there. It tends to be mobile things. We have reverse impressions. So what the clay was sealing over was, you can see whether it was a bag or a basket. It doesn't seem to be door ceilings, storerooms. This is mobile, transportable goods that are coming through. People are breaking the seals, maybe resealing them and sending them either to the Acropolis or outside of the city or to elsewhere. Here's some of the designs. We'll come back to these in a little bit here. And these are mostly typical of the local artistic style. These are some of the reverse impressions that show whether it's a basket or a bag or that sort of a thing. And also some things like this here is a Winkelhaken sort of tally and some models as well. And also this is sealing clay. So this would have been fresh clay that they would have been applying new sealings to. And the ceramics are not domestic. They're basically just cups. And anybody who's worked at a site in Syria has come across some military guard post with a bunch of bored teenagers on their military service drinking tea. And this is what I imagine was happening here at this guard post into the city. You basically have cups for people to drink their beer while they're waiting for people to come through and in and out. And we have a good range of dates here, which put the, you can't see this here, we'll just move that. About 2600 BC is when this starts and goes down to the Akkadian period is where we get the last of our radiocarbon dates from here, but it does extend into the Akkadian period. It's not going forward. Okay. Oops. So on the Acropolis Northwest, another location of the site. Here's my workmen digging. We excavated a very large area, a very large horizontal area. This is a plan of it. I'll come to some of the details there. In the 2B period, so pre-Akkadian period, we only have small exposures. You can see this little slot trench we put through a corridor, and we have some other rooms that are more fully excavated where you see things like this tanur, a bread oven, or actually probably a malting kiln for grains to store them. So limited exposure in the 2A period, not 2B. And these tanurs here, which were full of seeds, all the way to the top. So they were actually processing grain, probably to stop the germination process for transportation or storage. And here's some of those tanurs. And these tanurs were used in this portion of the palace throughout pre-Akkadian and into Akkadian periods. So they didn't seem to change what was being done in the Akkadian period. Here's some later ones. And overall, they were doing the same sort of thing as you see at the city gate. It's mostly administrative residue, seals, ceilings, but you also have things like agricultural processing artifacts as well, and some things like tablets that start to be appear in the Akkadian period. I'm just going to breeze through some of these just to get a little bit ahead. So these, unlike the city gates, rather than transportable objects, the dominant thing here are door ceilings. So these were storerooms that were being administered rather than transportable objects that presumably were coming through the gate up to the Acropolis. So I'm just going to, like I said, move through these. So we have, in terms of the artistic style, a thriving indigenous local style. So these are seal impressions on clay ceilings from 3D period, so right at the foundation of the lower town. And we have, these are all very typical of northern Mesopotamia. These look like things that are indigenous to the area. These are all things that anyone working in northern Mesopotamia would be familiar with. Even things like these languettes here, these probably were testers to make sure what the design looked like. And you have this one here, which you find on multiple seals. These are different languettes of 3 different languettes that all have the same seal impression. So the same seal was impressed on them. Another local design. And you have figurines, probably related to something to do with the economy, maybe animal husbandry. And you even have a sealed figurine here, the only one that I know of that's this elaborately sealed with a very high status seal showing some kind of a local ruler drinking beer, being waited on by attendants in his courtroom, or in his throne room. You also have some correlation between the Acropolis and the city gate. These are the same design, just a little bit different style, but it's the same scene. You have a quadruped, a horned quadruped with a suckling underneath, and that's probably a scorpion underneath the little one on the right, a person with outstretched arms and vegetation. This is something that we find at other sites too. On the left-hand side here, you see one from Telbrac, and you also see one from Chagar Bazar, also in the region. So this is a local motif that probably was involved in local exchanges. It's probably some mythology that everyone would have understood just by looking at this. We don't know what it is, but it's certainly something that would have been understood, a vernacular of artistic style to them. But you also find in this pre-Akkadian period at Tell Leilan, local designs. These animal protons are very, animal heads are very typical of the region. But you then have this little guy here who is a scorpion man. And that is not found in this region. This is a southern Mesopotamian motif. And so you have this integrated into a local design. You don't find these animal protons very much in the south, but you don't find these scorpion men in the north. And you have also this clearly imported design. This is a beautiful, beautiful rendering, seal impression. Here's the photograph of it. This does not belong anywhere in the north. This is not from there. In fact, this is the Lugalanda style, probably from a specific site in southern Mesopotamia. I have my ideas about where I think it's from, but it's not from the north. So the local inhabitants in their own administrative system were using imported seals as part of their own repertory. So you have also at this time Akkadian influence. I'm not going to get too much into how I know that, but things like this pattern here, some of the chairs and things you only really see in Akkadian designs. And so you have the coexistence of local imitation and imported Akkadian influenced glyptic during the Tell Leilan 2A period, which is pre-Akkadian. So this is an independent city-state that is operating in the shadow of a looming Akkadian empire that's moving into the area. And we have good radiocarbon dates for this sequence from 2A into to B. And this corresponds well with what we would think of as late Akkadian period. When the Akkadians finally do move in, which we'll come to here, they start to rebuild things. They're doing the same practices, but they rebuild. You can see this is the original 2B wall, and then 2A period, they rebuild it. 2B, no, 2A. This is a crenellated base, but slapped right up on top of this wall. They start to rebuild and reuse the cultic platform. You can see that realignment, that's that crenellated base. So this is the alignment of the walls pre-Akkadian, and they say, well, no, we want the walls to go this way. And so they just slap up some new facades on that and realign it a bit. But they keep doing the same thing in the palace. They don't raise it. And the late Akkadian glyptic also changes. So they're doing the same things, but they have a new administrator there. So first of all, we have Hayubum, that's his name. And he was a Shabra, which was a local governor. So this is total dominance of this site. They have a governor who sits there at the site of Shena, which was an independent city-state before the Akkadians came in, and they start producing. And we have textual evidence for what they were shipping around: 40,000 liters of barley, 4,200 liters of old emmer, and some quantity of new emmer, 4 sipar, which is in southern Mesopotamia, from Nagar, which is Telbrac. So we actually have textual evidence for what they were moving around in this community. So this was centralized control of grain production. And we also have from this time at Tell Leilan, we have horns showing up, which probably reinforces Naram Sin's hold on the pantheon, and we have new artistic styles, late Akkadian, which correspond to that. This is a seal. These are both seal impressions from Tell Leilan. So it's fitting right well into the late Akkadian style. So they've moved into this city. They're setting up shop. They've got a governor. Let's build a temple, right? Or something, some big public building. Let's do that. So you bring in big basalt blocks. You build a it's abandoned. It's never finished. They just leave. It took a long time for Harvey Weiss to figure out what was going on here. But they've actually found where they were chopping the stones into the foundation stones up to, and they just abandoned even the production area now. So this is what we call the unfinished building. And we have the end of this, which dates to about 2200 BC. We have a lot of radiocarbon dates for this abandonment phase. After the abandonment phase, the palaces, there's no one in the palace. No one's doing anything. There's no glyptic, there's no administration, there's no production, there's no anything. But we do have some people that move into the palace and set up a little room, their own little house, in the post-Akkadian phase. These are squatters that have see this palace there. They're like, well, got nowhere else to go. Let's set up camp in the palace, and we have a room in there. But that doesn't last for very long either. This is an image of the post-Akkadian rooms here. So the Curse of Akkad, what is it? What's going on here? Is it the curse on Naram Sin? Well, we know that they talked about famine and starvation and that sort of a thing. And we have evidence at Tell Leilan across the entire site of this large hiatus wind-blown deposit on top of everything at post-Akkadian. Now remember, this is in a rain-fed agricultural zone. What happens if the rain stops falling? What happens? Well, in southern Mesopotamia, you can irrigate. Those rivers may diminish in size, but they're not going to stop flowing. They're perennial, they're coming from high mountains. But if the rain stops falling on the plains, you can't grow your crops. There's no infrastructure for it. They didn't have deep wells that could tap the groundwater. So southern Mesopotamia can carry on, but northern Mesopotamia is in real trouble if the rain stops. And as it turns out, we've now come across, been building an environmental picture of the past, which shows that at right about 4200 BC, or 4200 years ago, 4.2 KABP, there is an event. So we have these from Gulf of Oman Core, Lake Van, Sorak Cave, Kilimanjaro, all over the world. We have evidence for a global Bond 3 4.2 KABP abrupt climate event. And this affected the currents in the oceans, which then affected the Mediterranean westerlies, which pick up moisture as they move to the east and dump all of their moisture onto Southwest Asia, which is where the Middle East is. If you have a disruption of these currents, those Mediterranean westerlies stop, the rain does not fall. And we have evidence for this large disruption at 4.2 thousand years ago from all over the world. And it would have had different localized effects, but in Southwest Asia, it would have been extreme drought. And how long did it last? 200 years, approximately. So how long can an empire that is based on grain production survive when one of their bread baskets in the north is not getting rain anymore? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 200 years? Who knows? And here's what the survey data shows us, that in the Akkadian period, you have a healthy settlement distribution. This is the post-Akkadian period. So this is what happens. People just abandon their sites. There's no inhabitation in the area. And then the old Babylonian period, people come back in and reoccupy this area after the drought is over, after the 200-year drought is gone. One of the exceptions to this is Urkesh, Tel Mosen. And it's possible that because they were a local capital, because they did not have their entire economic system replaced by Akkadians, that they were actually able to survive and weather the storm through some kind of a diversified economy. So the Curse of Akkad seems to be the result of over-specialization coupled with drought, and they were incapable of adapting to changing climatic conditions. And they also had such a top-down control that any sort of adaptability would have been repressed. They also were expanding into territories that had their own regional identities, so there's a lot of competition to take over when any sort of political vacuum starts to form. So the end of the Akkadian Empire was marked by abandonment in the north of Mesopotamia, And there we actually have records of what was called the repeller of the Amorites wall, built to stem nomads crossing down into the south. So what do you do when your city no longer functions? Well, I don't know about you, but I would probably be incapable of becoming a herder or a nomad. I live in a city, right? What could you do? What could they do? They only knew one way of existing. So what it seems like some people did is they became raiders. And they started to just sack neighboring cities. They didn't have stuff, so they went and tried to get somebody else's. And this was affecting the southern Mesopotamia, and they built a big, great wall, 180 kilometers wall, but they were also being attacked by the Gutians from the east, and the Akkadian army was sacked, and Akkad was destroyed around 2100 BC. So, as a parallel to this, just as a coda, let's look at the examples from this, right? In Syria, last time I was in Syria was 2009, and I was flying into Qamishli airport, and when I was up high, I was looking down trying to figure out what crops were in the fields. I'm like, I don't know what is being planted down there, and as I started to get lower and lower, I realized there were no crops. So this is what I'm used to here, what you see in this image. This is, like I said, it's more like Nebraska than like Nevada. It's not really a desert. It's quite green and lush and lots of crops. But this is what you saw in 2008, 2009. Nothing. And what happened after that is, and actually this is a result of a trend in the Middle East where temperatures it's getting significantly hotter and drier in the winters in recent years. So this is something that we've been tracking, that climate is getting more extreme in this area. And so when you have a climate event, it's felt pretty strongly. And so this is a dip you can see from all of these different data sets here in the region that show that there is a below average level of rain for those years. And here's another one of those percentage of anomalies of annual November and April rains. Basically, it just stopped raining. And this is tracking satellite data showing just what I said, that this wasn't just an illusion of my own locality. This is satellite images showing 2007, and in 1 year you have far less vegetation in this region. And these are the percentage below annual rainfalls for each of these areas, especially up here in Qamishli, Hasaka, where I did, where Tell Leilan is. You have 23% lower precipitation. And what do they do there? They grow grain. 83% is wheat, 10% is barley, and very, very little else is grown there. There have been some pushes to do some other things like olive production, but they're still grain dominated. And it was subsidized by the government in great quantities. They were subsidizing fuel for harvesting and transportation, the fertilizers as well. So they were encouraging this monocrop culture. And even the water table to get the groundwater from the aquifer below them has been diminishing over the years. They've been using as much as they possibly can, and it's now having to be rebored over and over and over again. And you have these spikes. So the Syrian wheat production drops in these drought years. And what happens when you don't own your land and you don't have a crop? Well, you have to leave the landscape. You have to leave the countryside. And so in 2008, in particular, the city of Aleppo, which had long been the second largest city in the country, suddenly became the largest city by a huge margin. But no one knows exactly how large, because you had these tent cities popping up all around the inhabited area, and they had nothing. They had no jobs, they had no land, they had no future. So trying to find something in the only inhabited areas that they could live, but there was no room for them. So you have in 2011, you have a civil war. And it's not so simple to say that climate change caused this, that drought caused this. It's a multiplicity of causes that led to this civil war. It was over-specialized economy, short-term drought in this case, and inadaptability. The government was extremely repressive. They did not allow people to leave the country or to do other endeavors, even locally. They had poor economic strategies, a lack of foresight, and competition. Turkey is damming the Tigris and the Euphrates River, keeping the water for themselves. And aquifer reduction in semi-arid zones dropped from 25 meters in 1980 to 125 meters in 2008. So they're depleting their resources and not really planning for the future. So in this case, the lessons from the past was that this wasn't a curse, but it was really, in the past, it was hubris, and maybe today it is as well. Climate instability is a contributing factor, but that doesn't mean that we have no recourse to change. Inadaptable governments and economies will struggle, and over-specialization and bad strategies are not really visible until it's too late, so you have to think ahead. And competition, it will increase demand on these resources, so it's not going to get easier, it's going to get harder. So we can use these lessons to try and, of both from the ancient past in Syria, but also modern day Syria, to try and get ahead of the game when this might come to affect us. And here's just one last image of how things are getting hotter across the globe. So it's coming. All right. Ran over a little bit, sorry about that.
Well, thank you. Karen, I think we're at 12:30, right? So do you want to say any last remarks? And we should probably just wrap up. Dr. Hari, we can't hear you.
Sleep.
There we go. I don't know. I kept saying I won't unmute you. I guess the computer decided it was tired of hearing my voice, so I apologize. Yeah, well, thank you so much for that really interesting talk. It is 12:30. I think if there are probably we might, if people need to check out, they can check out. And if Andrew can stay just a few minutes, we can ask some, although I see in the chat. So if you've got a question, jump in real quickly. Thank you so much, Andrew. We appreciate it. And we also appreciate our connections with CSN. Andrew, I assume, is still very active in the Archaeological Society. So just a good local archaeologist that everybody, obviously an international archaeologist as well, but also very active locally. So our students, I'm glad y'all had a chance to meet him. So thank you.
Us in person and online. I guess we'll leave it as a wrap there. Thanks all, and enjoy your Valentine's Day. Enjoy some romance now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Any questions here? Since you actually came?